Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking through the second explanation of gambling addiction and looking at the cognitive theory. And we see that they make us look at specific reference to what they call cognitive biases. So, the question that we should ask is what are the cognitive factors relating to the predisposition for gambling? Now, of course, if you remember the previous kind of video and we look at the evaluation point, we looked at Sharpe's research, and they said that actually what the learning does, it potentially change people's cognitions, and some of the cognitions that they potentially had were things like kind of um, control illusions of control, or they can control the situation, or they may kind of have a change in thoughts and kind of how they view kind of wins and losses. So there's quite a lot of cognitive factors that lead to a person to addiction, and I'm going to talk you through this. Now, in order to kind of elaborate the differences between the cognitions of somebody who has problem gambling versus somebody who doesn't, I'm going to turn to a study by Griffiths. Now, what we find here is it's actually not even um, people who are addicted to gambling, they're just regular gamblers. Now, there's two reasons for this. Is first of all, to be unethical to take somebody who is addicted to gambling and then put them through this particular study because Griffiths got them to actually gamble. And also, I think it's actually makes quite a much nicer contrast because this is just regular gamblers. So if I contrast two groups, one group who gamble and one group who don't, the group that gambles definitely think differently compared to people who don't gamble. And what they're mostly looking at is verbalizations because we can't read people's cognition. So he got them to kind of talk through their actions as they gambled. And what we find quite interestingly is several different things. So these regular gamblers, they said, believe that they are more skillful. Now they were playing a slot machine, so there isn't any skill in playing a slot machine. It's kind of like there isn't actually a skill in throwing the dice. Now, you may not believe me because you might think that you're better at throwing a dice than somebody else. The truth of it is that dice and slot machines and almost every form of gambling, besides poker or places where it relies on the individual actually bluffing people, it's always mathematical. It's always about what is the statistical chance of it landing on a particular number. So you can't actually be more skillful at picking up a coin, putting it in the slot machine, and pulling the arm down. So therefore, this is a bit irregular, but it didn't just stop at this idea of skill. They said things like that you can bluff the machine or that the machine had a particular mood, therefore expressing that regular gamblers generally do think differently about gambling compared to non-regular gamblers. He also so she also goes on to kind of interview them and kind of spoke to them about this, and we see that they refer to things like near misses or near wins. Now, this is obviously might just be kind of within our nature, and maybe we like to view things kind of optimistically. But the reality of it is that if you say are running a race and you plan to come first and you come in second, you've lost. If the number I need to land on is six and it lands on seven, I haven't landed on six. Um, therefore it's not a near win or a near miss. It is not what I need. So therefore, this does highlight that there are kind of bizarre kind of cognitions that a gambling addict has. Now, I do repeat the question because obviously in the lesson we were discussing what these cognitions are, and of course I'm going to kind of go on and explain them a little bit further. But what I should say is that we need to view these cognitions as being dysfunctional thinking. And ultimately, that is the problem. That's why they go on to become an addict, because this dysfunctional thinking, it says here, distorts their perception. And of course, and it says here, perception of skill and luck, as well as the skill of others. So therefore, what happens is that they continue to gamble under a context where potentially a kind of person who didn't have dysfunctional thinking would say, you know what, I need to stop, or this is not right for me. So it's kind of then quite bizarre that the companies that are advertising gambling have at the end of their adverts, like when the fun stops, stop, because ultimately the person who's addicted to gambling has got dysfunctional thinking, so therefore can't stop. And so the reason it's called a cognitive bias is because these this dysfunctional thinking ultimately means that I interpret the situation in a biased way. Now, um, I'm going to focus on a whole bunch of cognitive distortions or cognitive biases, and specifically by research by Oy and Gordon, which is really quite important for us. Just to put it in terms of context, I don't think we need to use this name in terms of knowledge. I think the actual knowledge of the different cognitive distortions are perhaps more important. Before we get there, I just have a very strong reminder here is that when you play a game, see you have your roulette machine there, is that what we got to know is that gambling is about statistical chance. Therefore, there's always an objective probability of failure rather than anything else. We need to kind of recognize that even in a situation where I'm betting, you know, I might bet on both black and red, the gamblers like the house has one slot in there that's green, meaning that actually nobody will win other than the house. So therefore, I can't control things. I haven't machined the dice. The dice has to have six sides. The cards, there's a certain pattern to the cards. So therefore, we when we have these cognitive biases, we have to view them as being irrational, because they are quite unhelpful to us, and therefore ultimately result us in behaving, as it says here, in inappropriate ways, doing things that I shouldn't do. Now, just to kind of lighten the mood in terms of this, we have this silly picture of a cat gambling. Yes, I'm obsessed with animals gambling, you could say, but if you really just look at what it's saying, it says, I haven't won a hand all night. Payout now due. That perhaps refers to this dysfunctional thinking of believing that the world is just, that ultimately, if I just kind of bide my time, I will ultimately get what I deserve. However, maths or the objective nature of failure means that I don't deserve anything any more than anyone else. So let's look at some of these particular dysfunctional thinking or the cognitive biases. The first one, probably the most obvious one, is gambler's fallacy. So it says here, completely random events can be influenced by recent events. So therefore, it's easy for a gambler to have this understanding that, of course, there's been, 20 times that the machine has kind of not paid out, so therefore it's going to pay out now because it's the 21st time. It's kind of like equally if we probably all kind of buy into this a bit that if I flipped a coin 10 times and it's landed on heads, then clearly I'm more likely to expect that it's a tails is going to come. But of course, this is a fallacy because there's the statistical chance it's still 50-50 of me landing on a head again. And obviously, this could be linked to this illusion of control, saying that you can do things in order to change a particular behavior. So some people call this superstitions, but of course, it's called illusion of control. This idea of control. I cannot control a statistical chance. So me wearing my lucky pants is not going to change kind of the outcome of the situation. Of course, a lot of these will work together. And so, of course, if I do believe that a machine is due to pay out or something like that, I could believe that I can beat the system. Now, unfortunately, we talk about this in terms of gambling, that the house will always win. I can't beat the system. I can only beat the system if I change the odds. That's why something like poker um, is is about bluffing, and it's about kind of getting people to believe that you have cards that you don't have or that you do have. you can't actually beat the system because it's all down to statistical chance. So I can't believe that ultimately anything I do can change the events of it just being down to statistical. Like I can't go to the local corner shop and buy a lottery ticket, and expect that just because you know I'm doing whatever I can that I will win the particular jackpot. Now I do use something like lottery tickets because it's kind of an easy analogy, but of course we're not really talking about a gambling addict kind of buying lottery tickets. Um, Also referred to in the previous learning section about how people thought about the gambling. Um, Blanco calls this recall bias, that potentially we don't kind of view things in the same way as a person who doesn't have this recall bias. So a gambling addict will often overestimate a win, okay, and therefore kind of put more importance on it, or kind of even believe that they won more. And it says here, forgetting losses or underestimating losses. If you spend £1,000 to win £100, that's the problem. So I suppose kind of while I'm saying this, I am thinking, well, this is where the partial reinforcement potentially comes into play. The fact that it does reinforce the gambling behavior, but ultimately, what Blanco is saying is that those 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 little wins kind of end up being slightly kind of more important than they need to, and therefore, of course, all this results in is people actually gambling more than they need to. Um, and and this then links a bit to that picture of the cat where they kind of say, well, I kind of deserve to win. I've been losing all evening. It's about time. Now, of course, once again, we don't live in a just world. Um, and as such, there's no reason why somebody who's been losing ultimately will have a turn of events and win. Now, that's the content there. I think a good understanding of those different biases are. I think please just reminder that you have to explain why the person will become a gambler. And the key to that is more to do with the fact that they don't give up gambling when they potentially should. And so therefore worth considering. Now, just before we moved on to the evaluation points, I would just want to remind you that not everyone will have exactly the same views. And I use this example in class, which I really quite like because it's just something slightly different, and actually is looking at the cognitive theory in terms of thinking these people might have a brain kind of thinking that's completely different to somebody else. Now, what Maraziti actually did was used a psychometric test called the Wisconsin card sorting task. Kind of think of it a bit like playing solitaire. Now, if any of you actually have ever played solitaire, certainly on a computer, you have the option of clicking the button that says kind of go back a step or undo. Now, what they found was that gambling addicts had a different way of viewing things compared to kind of people who don't have this addiction. And the key to it is that ultimately, sometimes when you're playing a game of cards, you could get two choices. I could either play the 10 in row one, or I can play the 10 in row five, and you might choose row five. And of course, that choice may lead to the game coming to a close. You can't move any further. So technically, I could go all the way back where I had that choice and then go back to the 10 in row one and play that one and see if that leads to a win. But it says here, gamblers had difficulty finding alternative ways to solve the problem. So in other words, what they actually did is um, when they went back to the the choice where they had the two tens, that played the same number again and again and again. In fact, what happened is they got frustrated, and actually became even more kind of like, or less efficient at kind of solving the problem. And he called this cognitive rigidity, and possibility that actually what happens is that somebody who's a gambling addict doesn't can't see outside of the cognitions that lead them to gambling. And I think that's kind of quite interesting. Now, of course, you could use this as kind of a confirmation that there's cognitive biases out there, though, of course, you just might need to be careful as to kind of what details you add. Looking at the evaluation points, what we do find is that there is always going to be a strength with the cognitive model, and ultimately it's down to individual differences. Now, this is a kind of, this could be seen as a generic point because anything to do with psychopathology and cognitive model can explain individual differences. But of course, we need to give the example here. It says millions of people gamble, but not everyone becomes an addict. In other words, it's saying that the cognitive model is able to understand why some people, just some people, develop addiction because they have the irrational thinking patterns. And so, of course, individual differences may actually kind of result in why some people become gambling compared to others, and therefore it must be seen as a strength. So I quite like this. So you could either then use kind of the example of kind of the cognitive rigidity that they potentially have that where other people don't in order to kind of make this kind of a overall strength. Just to support this, I have Berger and Smith basically looked at a particular personality factor. So, in other words, they're saying that some people, some individuals have specifics about their cognitions that make them kind of different. And they had this factor called control motivation. In other words, their belief, and it says that they wrongly believe their skill can make a difference to the outcome. So you can see with a gambler who says, "No, I'm better at this," and I used an example in class where, I've been playing a board game and somebody's literally taken the dice out of my hand and kind of implying that you don't know how to throw a dice, but I do. And you can see that that does sound ridiculous because it's throwing a dice, which is down to chance. So the problem with individual differences explanation and the cognitive model is that I kind of still feel we need to kind of consider other factors, and these become quite important. So this is just a however, um, and you could ask about other factors. And suppose maybe at this point, maybe learning could be an issue because we could think about, okay, so maybe I don't have these cognitive factors unless I actually have certain experiences in terms of my gambling addiction. So so it's quite a big point, definitely worth considering in terms of looking at peak, maybe writing PEA, EA, things like that, kind of elaborating on it and seeing kind of what you can do with that. Then I turn to also quite a detailed evaluation point here. Um, and what I need to kind of say is that if I believe in the cognitive model that people who are gambling addicts have these faulty cognitions or irrational thoughts, um, surely those irrational thoughts should actually explain their whole behavior. So it says here, a limitation of the research is that there are sometimes findings that are non-supportive of the logic that underlies the cognitive explanation. Okay, so what I mean by that is that surely I either have the relevant knowledge on gambling, so I know all about the odds on gambling, and therefore I don't have cognitive distortions, or you could flip that around and say, okay, so I have cognitive distortions. Surely then I'm not going to possess the relevant knowledge related to gambling. But actually, there's two pieces of research that actually show us that that's not always the case. Now, the first one is this one here by Ben Shane and Ladouceur. Now, I like this piece of research because it kind of is a bit silly, um, because it's so simple. So what they did is they went to find a group of students who are trained in statistics. So these are people who, for some reason, decided that what they'd like to learn more about is statistics. So therefore, they're good at statistics and they've learned a lot about it. So they know more about statistics than the average person like you and me. Okay, but it says that these students, okay, were no different from irrational gambling related cognitions. So, in other words, I put there in green to say, well, I would expect them to know better they know the odds. So when they buy a lottery ticket, they know what the odds are of them winning. So therefore, why do they buy a lottery ticket? Because they know that the odds aren't in their favor, yet they do. Once again, that's illogical. The cognitive model will say, well, surely if you know the cognitions related to this, then you shouldn't gamble. DeFabo looked at the opposite side of things. Okay, so now actually looking at pathological gamblers and say, okay, so they have these distortions. Surely they can't know about the numbers. But of course, it says they were just as accurate. So, in other words, even though they had all this illogical thinking behind it, they still were able to say, you know what, actually, I know what the odds are. So, of course, that in itself is illogical and therefore kind of is quite interesting for the cognitive model that people, despite knowing certain things, are still kind of drawn into it. Now, once again, between the knowledge and the evaluation kind of content here, there's a lot for you to write about. So please kind of plan your essays and stuff like that because they have already asked an essay specifically on the cognitive model. So therefore, they can ask about any particular section kind of relating to this. The things that I would ask you to potentially consider, if they're not going to ask you another 16 marker on this, could they ask you a short essay or could they ask you a very kind of small 4 mark knowledge question? So you need to make sure that you have that depth of understanding for this particular section. Or they alternatively could turn to something like this, which is an applied question. Now, this applied question is from 2013, so therefore not part of your specification, but really does highlight this idea that actually sometimes reading the question is really important for this because you might read through the scenario about Sam and go, oh, yeah, this is all about risk factors. Clearly, he's young, he feels bored, he hangs out with his team, with his workmates, um, and therefore we can probably find quite a few risk factors there. But if you look at the question, it says, using your knowledge of the psychology of addictive behavior. So it says, explain knowledge of addictive behavior explain. So therefore, this is not about risk factors. This is about the knowledge of addictive behavior. So that is learning theory and the cognitions. And then this question actually then becomes a lot more challenging because I've got to read through the scenario and find those two things. Now, you probably could find the learning theory quite easily. It says here, Sam has a few wins in the first week and finds the atmosphere very exciting. Now, clearly, this is learning theory, okay? Um, and so therefore, hopefully you can see justifies why I added operant conditioning into my knowledge section because that would clearly make this a lot more interesting and a lot more easier to talk about rather than partial and variable reinforcement. But I hope you can kind of see that. Now, the cognitive model is not necessarily as easy to see or certainly easy to explain. But we see at the bottom here that it says here, and is now spending over half his wages. So clearly he's not thinking that one through. He's overestimating his wins, underestimating his losses. He shouldn't really be doing this. And of course, this is kind of bad for him. So we can start talking about maybe some of the cognitive biases that he has that is a little bit different to the others. So that's all I need to kind of talk about in terms of content here. I do hope that you have found it interesting, and I'll continue to record these videos to the best of my ability for now.